There we are. Okay, so let's get started. This was a shiur that I gave about 7 years ago, and I remembered that I had given this shiur. It's always good to know where you have something. Okay. Okay, so there's a Gemara in Gittin Daf Yud Tes that states as follows: Tanya, Eidim she'ein yodim lachtom. If witnesses do not know how to sign their names, so what's the remedy in the times of the Talmud? V'kar'in lahem niyar chalak u'mimalaim et hakaraim dio. They should make tears in a blank paper and have them fill in the tears with ink. In other words, do something that they can identify. That's basically it. Create a stencil so that they can fill it in. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel bameh dvar mamurim begitei nashim. But that's only true with bills of divorce, where the rabbis feel that they need to do whatever is possible in order to procure a get for a woman so that she doesn't become an aguna. Aval b'shichrurei avadim u'sha'ar kol hashtaros. But when it comes to freeing slaves and all other contracts where there's no sense of urgency that we've got to get this done, okay, im yodim likros v'lachtom chosmim v'vlav ein chosmim. If the Eidim know how to read it and to sign it, then they sign. And if not, they do not sign. We don't make any accommodations, create stencils or whatever it is. So the Gemara now says, Karye mandoch arshma. Up until now, we've only been talking about knowing how to sign their names. Why did you introduce another idea about being able to read it? So chisuri mechzer avahachi ketani. So the Gemara employs a phrase that appears in many places in Shas that basically says there's a little piece missing from this brisa, and that's why it comes out disjointed. But it should be read as follows: Eidim she'ein yodim likros koren lifneim v'chosmin. That if the witnesses do not know how to read the shtar, then you can read it in front of them and they can sign it, referring to the get. V'she'ein yodim lachtom, and if they don't know how to sign their names, then you create a stencil for them. Amar Reb Shimon ben Gamliel bameh dvar mamurim begitei nashim. So Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says that this is only true by bills of divorce. Aval shichrurei avadim u'shar kol hashtaros im yodim likros v'lachtom chosmim v'vlav ein chosmim. But with all other contracts, if they know how to read it and they know how to sign their names, then you employ them. But if they can't either read it or sign, then you don't use them. And if that means that you have to delay doing the contract, then so be it. Over Rabbi Elazar. What says Rabbi Elazar? My time at the Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. What is his reason? Why is he lenient with Gittin? Shelo Yehu benot Yisrael agunot, to prevent agunot among the Jewish people. Amar Rava, halacha Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. He says that's the halacha. So Rav Gamda Mishmei de Rava Amar Ein Halacha, and Rav Gamda says that that's not the halacha. Be'ela keman kerabanan. So what are you going to tell me? It's like the Rabbanan that you don't fill in their names, with a stencil, and you don't read it in front of them. The ha hahu the avad uvda b'shar shtaros the nagde Rav Kahana. In other words, the Rabbanan seem to say that it's okay to do this for all shtaros. Right, so the Gemara says, but there was once a situation where a person was allowed to stencil their name, and Rav Kahana gave that person lashes. So tirgama akriya. So the answer is basically that we paskin like the Chachamim, that it's kosher to read it in front of them, even though they don't understand. And then the Gemara goes on. And talks about Rav Yehuda mitzdaer kari v'chasim. Amar le'ula lo tzriches the Rabbi Elazar mara the Eretz Yisrael karu kamei v'chasim. And Rav Yehuda apparently was upset to do this, to read and then to have the witnesses sign. And Ula says, you don't need to be upset about it because Rabbi Elazar is the Morid Asra of Eretz Yisrael. And when they read it in front of him, he signs it even though he hasn't even read it. I see what it says. I think what it means is the Rav Nachman karu kamei safrei dayane v'chasim, and Rav Nachman, they would read it in front of him, the scribes, and he would sign it. And so I think what the explanation of this Gemara is, let me just see. Okay, so Rav Yehuda was upset that they were reading it and then signing it, and Ula says you don't need to be upset because they were doing it in front of Rabbi Elazar and in front of Rabbi Nachman. But then the Gemara says v'dafka Rav Nachman v'safrei dayane, but it only works because it was Rav Nachman and his scribes of the Beis Din, the Islahu Eimasa, because they have fear of heaven, they have reverence for him. Aval Rav Nachman v'safrei achrini, safrei dayani ve'inin shachrin alo. But if it would have been Rav Nachman and other scribes, or the Beis Din scribes and another person other than Rav Nachman that they don't have reverence for, then it wouldn't work. And that's what we saw in the halacha yesterday, that you need to have, it'll only work lechatchila to permit this if it's the head of the Beis Din and it's the scribes of the Beis Din. So we already saw this halacha, and we read it inside Choshen Mishpat. Okay. And now we look at a tour in Even HaEzer, which is the section of Shulchan Aruch that deals with the laws of Ksuva. And the tour writes, She'ela la'avi Adoni Harosh. My father was asked the following question. Ayodea lachtom ve'ena yodea likros. If a witness is able to sign his name, but he just doesn't know how to read the Ksuva. Im chasum v'ksuva. Is he allowed to be a signatory on a Ksuva? Ve'heshiv davar zeh toli b'minhag. And my father, the Rosh, said it all depends on the minhag. Ki yesh mekomos sheregilim lachtom b'ksuva l'chavod u'shnei edim chosmim b'rosh hashita v'al pihem mekaimim aksuva. He says there are some places where the chasan signs the ksuva just to give him that honor, and then the two witnesses sign on a new line, but it's only based on the witnesses that we corroborate we are machshir the ksuva. So it's not really based on that person's signature. So in that kind of situation, even if the chassan doesn't know what is written in the ksuva, he can sign it. Then it's fine. But if they don't have the chassan sign and it's only the witnesses, then the witnesses have to be capable of reading the ksuv. And then he quotes from the Tshuvas Harashba, Al Am Haaretz Shabala Garish Ishta. There was a man who was not learned, he was somewhat illiterate, and he wanted to divorce his wife. Va'amrlo Beis Din sheyifra la ksuvasa. And the Beis Din said, well, you can divorce her, but you have to pay out her ksuva. That's her promissory note. Va'amar shalohaven kishakara hachazan haksuva. And his claim is that I didn't understand. When they read the ksuva at the chuppah, I didn't know what they were saying. I didn't know what I was committing myself to. V'lohaven hatzanoim. And he didn't understand the conditions that were made before the marriage. V'shalu es pi harav meir beheshiv deshomen lo. And they asked Rabbi Meir. It could be the Maharami Rottenberg. I'm not sure who that is. And his response was that his claim is valid. V'hu omer de ein shomin lo, but the Rashba says the chazaka sheheidu edim ba'al peh ve'al piv chasmu bo. In other words, I think what he means to say that the Rashba himself is of the opinion that you don't listen to the Am Haaretz who says that he didn't understand, because we assume that the witnesses were there to corroborate that the man knew what he was signing on. V'im einata omer kain lo hinach dechiv la'amei haaretz. He says, because if you don't say that, then you're not going to, you haven't given room for anyone who has a promissory note against an ignoramus to be able to collect his debt. Below al hanashim, nor are you providing an ability for women to collect their ksuva. Kulam yitanu kain, because then everyone's going to make that complaint. Right. Ve'ein elu ela divrei tema. And the Rashba says that therefore I'm truly astounded that Rabbi Meir would be able to make such an exception. But what can I do? The elder sage already paskin that way. But if it were up to me, I wouldn't allow such an argument to prevail. Ve'eni yodeya lama nechabe el hakelim mishum dechaza gavra. He says, but the Torah writes in very interesting language, I don't know why we have to hide ourselves under the utensils. That's what in other words, why should we have to retreat just because a great Rosh Yeshiva paskined that we grant the argument of the ignoramus? Kevin de tiyufta lo chaza, since maybe had he heard the argument of the Rashba, he himself would have retracted. Ula inyan halacha nearly kedivrei harashba mishum deim lo kain lo shavkes chay d'chol amei haaretz yomu kain. And the Torah says, and I happen to agree with the Rashba. He says, once you open that can of worms, once you open that Pandora's box and say that a person can claim ignorance, then you're not going to allow anyone to ever again to accept, to be forced to pay out a promissory note. Okay, now the Shulchan Aruch in Even HaEzer, which we haven't seen yet, is b'makom she'ein regilim lachtom b'ksuva ela haru'uyim lahayid, in a place where the only people who are signatories on the ksuva are witnesses and no one else is signing, lo yachtom mi she'eino yodea likros. Then only people who know to read the ksuva should be allowed to sign on the ksuva. That's literally in the Shulchan Aruch. Comes along the Ramah, B'lachein am haaretz shebala garesh, and therefore, if you have an ignoramus who wants to divorce his wife, and later he wants to make the financial claim when she says, pay me out my ksuva, he says, well, I didn't know what was written in it. I had no idea what I was signing on to. Eino neman, he's not believed. Because we must assume that the witnesses knew what they were doing. The witnesses read the ksuva. They corroborated with the party of interest, the chassan, before they signed, that he knew what he was signing on, because otherwise they would never have signed. So therefore, you can assume that when there is a ksuva, that it is legit, no matter how educated the chassan is, he cannot later claim that I didn't know what I was signing on to, or I didn't know what I was committing myself to. Because if the witness is signed, we can assume that they were witness to the fact that the person indebted himself to the terms of the promissory note, which is the ksuva. Well, the problem, of course, is, as you and I know, that this is not the case anymore. So how do we get around this? That's really our question, right? So just a couple of sources. The Sefer Ezer Mikodesh. Let's see. He says, Mikol Makom Masha Nahug Barov HaKihilos Kedoshos Shel Medinos Elu. And he's living in the early 19th century. He says, what I've noticed is happening in most of our religious communities, Shirak Shnayim HaChosim Malaksuvos Medinos Elu, Echad Mehem Eno Yodea Likros Klal. He says, usually what we allow is one educated witness, and we allow the other witness to be uneducated, doesn't even know how to read the Ksuva. V'lifamim gam hachazan einav kamu milikros, ve'eno yachol likros, kamo shahashamash eno yachol. He says, a lot of the times we also know that when they read the Ksuva publicly, the person who's reading it mumbles through because he doesn't know how to read it properly. But he says, Keven shekorim haksuva b'tzibor tachas hachupa shaykh bazeh emasa kemo bedin b'dayan v'sofer shalo kemefurish b'simen memhei b'choshen Mishpat. V'harei kan shu milsa David ligluyi ein bazeh tzad pisel deoraisa. But the Sefer Ezer HaKodesh writes that because the ksuva is being read in public, he says before when he was talking about the chazan, I think the chazan is a person is not the person who's reading it publicly. He's the person maybe who's the overseer, and he's the one maybe this is the Masader Kiddushin. He doesn't know how to read it well. But he says, but since they read the ksuva publicly under the chuppah, there is a sense of reverence that no one is going to allow the ksuva to be unenforced. In other words, the fact that it's being publicly recited in front of a crowd of, let's say, 100 people, gives the ksuva an additional power of collection, even if the witnesses didn't know what they were signing to. And it's almost like no one would involve themselves in committing themselves to a contract when the contract is so publicly exposed. Even if you didn't know, but you can't claim that later, like we paskined before, that if a scribe reads the contract to the dayan, since he has reverence for the dayan, we know that he's not lying. Similarly, if a ksuva is read in the public, and it states in the ksuva that the guy is going to owe her $500,000 if he divorces her, then no one is going to be able to claim later that they didn't know what was going on. The kevin shall pi minhag somchen es atzmo al kriyas amoret tzedek b'ksuvos uv'chol ksavim shebeir ein od chashash pischon pe bazeh gam lechatchila v'chol ksavim ushtaru shenhag b'chazan v'shamash. He says, and therefore, since the minhag is that they read the ksuva publicly, there's no longer any concern that the people who were involved in the preparation of the ksuva didn't know how to read it, or didn't know what they were signing on. Uchavar deos kol balei hashtaros al edim hayeduim gam shiyodim sheyeh she'enam yodim likros v'savri v'kiblu uv'chai gavna in kpeda. He says, and therefore this is already the understanding of the scribes who draw up the stars and the parties of interest. Everyone knows that the witnesses are not literate and are not reading the ksuva, and everyone accepts that. And it's no different from a person who basically says, draw up the contract, I trust you implicitly, whatever you put in there, I will accept. So that's the reason. This is an early 19th century source for why we can allow witnesses who are illiterate and can't read the ksuva, why we allow them to sign. It's because they are confident and the chassan is confident that whatever he's committing himself to, he knows he trusts all the parties that are involved. The witnesses trust all the parties that are involved. We trust the rabbi who's the Masader Kiddushin. He knows what he's doing, and everyone is basically accepting and trusting. That happened to be the minhag back then. According to his argument, though, you really wouldn't need either. You wouldn't need either of them to be literate. Okay. The Rokeach writes, and this is now going back to the early 13th century. The minhag of the Chassanim was Acharei Mevarchem Birkas Erusin. After they take a break in the middle of the chuppah service, after the Masader Kiddushin says the first preliminary bracha, Mozgen Kos Sheni Mevarchem Birkas Nesuin. Then we say the second set of brachas, the Sheva brachas. Echad min ha'edim lokeach kenaf bigdo, no sein biad ha'chasan. And what used to happen is that under the chuppah, one of the witnesses would take the corner of his garment, give it into the hands of the chasan. The aid havi b'makom kala shehu lokeach, damrinan konen bekelav shalokeach, and the aid sort of acts as a representative of the kala to make a kinyan under the chuppah with the chasan, where he hereby indebts himself to the terms of the ksuva. The hachasan maknalo kol tanai haksuva, and in that transaction that takes place under the chuppah, the chasan indebts himself to all the terms of the ksuva. So you see, it used to be done under the ksuva, the kinyan. Today, most communities do the kinyan in the chasan's tish, but it's also a public spectacle. But he says that the witnesses need to read the ksuva to know what the chasan is indebting himself to. But if there's no time for them to read the ksuva, they ask the chasan, are you willing to indebt yourself to all the terms of the ksuva? And he says, he'll tell them yes. And as long as he says, yes, I accept all the terms of the ksuva, then they make the kinyan with him, and then they can sign the ksuva. So you see from the Rokeach as well, all the way back in the 13th century, that this was already considered an acceptable practice. Yalkut Yosef from the 20th century. This is the Piskei Halacha of Rav Ovadia Yosef. Lo yachtamu ala ksuva ki im edim ksherim bilvad. He says the only people who can be signatories on a ksuva are kosher witnesses. Of a lo krovim mishpacha, they cannot be relatives. Af im yesh sham bez edim ksherim v'hakrovim heim b'tosefes ala edim haksherim. And this is true even if you have two witnesses who are kosher that sign, and they want to get other people to sign it who are members of the family. That's not allowed. Okay. In the footnote of that discussion, he writes as follows. Zeh lashon maran b'shulchan aruch. The Shulchan Aruch writes, he quotes them, quoting the whole tshuva of the Rashba that no one can ever claim ignorance, and he quotes the Ezer Mekudash that we just read from the 19th century. Okay, he just quotes everything. Let's go to look at the Sefer Hanisuin Ki Hilchasam, which is a contemporary Sefer. Ein ha'edim chosmim ad shikru es nusach shtar aksuva mila b'mila. Listen to what he writes. It's like a psak halacha. The witnesses should not sign unless they read the ksuva word for word. And when the witnesses themselves who are signing do not understand the text, then two other people should read it and explain to them what its contents are, and then and only then should they sign. Amnam, but if the witnesses hear the ksuva being read, and they understand in public, and they understand the text based on what's being read to them, because they're just illiterate. They can't read, but they can understand the words, and they hear it being read in the congregation. Even if only one person is reading it, b'shas ha'chuppah, at the time of the chuppah, yicholom lihistamich al zeh b'lachtom al ksuva. That's good enough for them to sign the ksuva. Afilu lichatchila af shehem atzmam lo karu, even though they didn't read it. And that's why I've noticed there's a minority custom that sometimes the witnesses sign under the chuppah instead of signing in the chassan's dish after it's been read. V'yesh makomos, there are other places, shenagu shahidim mistamchim al ma shekaru b'chuppah aksuva af shelo shamu es akriya. Sometimes witnesses can rely on the fact that the ksuva is being read, even though they themselves don't hear it. And even though that's not really correct, because they can't really say for sure that they know what they're signing on, don't change the minhag, so that as not to cast aspersions on already existing ksuvas. And the witnesses should also not sign until the chassan fully understands what is written in the ksuva, so that the chassan understands what he's obligating himself to. And therefore the chassan cannot later claim that he didn't know what was written in the ksuva. And this is especially true when there are additional terms and obligations that are written in the ksuva. In other words, like that wedding I told you about yesterday, like if they had been able to sneak that in, the chassan would have had a good argument, even if they would have convinced the witnesses to sign, that he had no idea that he was committing himself to $250,000. Because it wasn't standard. And therefore, even if the chassan doesn't know the exact text, he doesn't understand the Aramaic, but you explain to him the terms, this is what you're obligating yourself to. Since he accepts it by remaining silent, it is still legally binding. So that's really what we rely on. So there are really two leniencies that we rely on whenever we do a wedding. And this is probably about 90% or 99% of the weddings that we do. When A, the witnesses are not conversant really in what is written clearly in the ksuva, and B, that the chassan himself doesn't really bother to read the ksuva. Any responsible Mesader Kiddushin has to carefully pull over the two witnesses together with the chassan and make sure that all three of them are being clearly explained what the terms of the ksuva are. You're committing yourself to approximately between $20,000 and $30,000 in Canadian in silver to your kala, that upon termination of the marriage, either through death or divorce, she's entitled to collect from your estate. Plus, you're also obligating yourself to provide for your bride over the course of the marriage that which is suitable for her standard of living. And that's really what all you need to explain. The witnesses need to see that the chassan is approving by nodding his head or whatever. And then I say to him, by you lifting up the handkerchief in front of the witnesses, you are committing yourself to all of the terms that are written in the ksuva. Do you want me to translate it for you word for word? And if usually he says no, it's not necessary, and then we go ahead and we make the kinyan. What happens, unfortunately, is that that's not always done. But what you see from here is that it is a serious issue, and it is really important to make sure that that is taken care of. Okay, so we'll hold it here for today. Let me wish you a good Shabbos, everyone. We're picking it up on Tuesday. Do I understand that correctly? We'll pick it up Tuesday morning. Have breakfast before you come, because Tuesday is a fast day. Or what you can also do, since the fast doesn't begin until 6:40, bring your coffee, bring your muffin or whatever you've got and have breakfast while we're learning. Okay.